The ocean is a keeper of secrets. In its crushing depths and on its wind-lashed shores, it holds stories of ships, of men, of lives swallowed by the abyss. But sometimes, the sea does not take. Sometimes, it simply watches. And what it leaves behind is not wreckage, but a silence so profound it becomes a scream echoing through history. This is not a story of a ship lost at sea. It is a story of land, of solid rock, and of three men who were there one moment, and gone the next, without a struggle, without a cry, without a single clue to explain their departure from the world of the living. This is the mystery of the Flannan Isles. To understand the profundity of the disappearance, one must first appreciate the sheer audacity of the lighthouse itself. In the wild, churning expanse of the North Atlantic, west of Scotland's Outer Hebrides, lies a cluster of jagged, unforgiving rocks known as the Flannan Isles, or as local fishermen called them with a superstitious dread, the Seven Hunters. For centuries, they were a navigator's nightmare, a graveyard of timber and iron. The cliffs of the largest island, Uneaten, rise 150 feet straight out of the water, perpetually shrouded in fog and pounded by swells borne from thousands of miles of open ocean. The force of the waves against these rocks is not merely water, it is a geological event, a hammer blow that can shake the very foundations of the island. The decision to build a lighthouse here was not just ambitious, it was an act of defiance against nature itself. The Northern Lighthouse Board, tasked with safeguarding the vital shipping lanes, commissioned one of the most brilliant and stubborn engineers of the age, David Allen Stevenson. The Stevenson family was a dynasty of lighthouse builders, men who wrestled with the elements as a matter of profession. But Uneaten tested even their resolve. The construction, which began in 1895, was a Herculean effort that lasted 4 long, brutal years. Every single piece of stone, every sack of cement, every pane of glass, had to be hauled up that fearsome cliff face on a precarious crane apparatus, often in weather that would send modern vessels running for port. The men who built it lived in temporary barracks on the island, and their accounts speak not of pride, but of a pervasive, grinding unease. They complained of tools vanishing from locked boxes. They spoke of hearing voices, not the shouts of their comrades, but distant, conversational tones on the wind when they were known to be utterly alone. Some reported a constant, prickling sensation of being watched from the high, misty grasslands of the island's summit. A few quit, forfeiting months of wages, stating flatly that the island was unlucky, that the bold folk did not want a tower there. Their warnings were dismissed as the ramblings of uneducated Highlanders, the price of progress. Finally, in December of 1899, the lighthouse was completed. It was a fortress. A 75-foot tower of immaculate masonry, topped with a first-order Fresnel lens, a masterpiece of prisms and light that could cast a beam visible for 24 nautical miles. Attached was a comfortable, well-stocked keeper's cottage, 3 bedrooms, a well-appointed kitchen, a parlor, and storage rooms packed with a year's supply of food, water, and fuel. It was designed to be entirely self-sufficient, a tiny, isolated pocket of Victorian order and comfort in the heart of the Atlantic chaos. The first keepers moved in, and for a year, the light operated without incident. Its rhythmic flash became a familiar, reassuring sight for passing ships, a symbol of man's triumph over the wild. The duty roster followed a strict pattern. 3 keepers were on the island at any time, a principal keeper and 2 assistants. They served a 6-week stint, after which a lighthouse tender would brave the seas to deliver supplies and rotate one man out. It was a life of rigid routine, of meticulous log-keeping, of polishing brass and trimming wicks. The men who chose this life were a special breed, not sailors, but often former seamen who had traded the motion of a deck for the solid, lonely rock. They were stoic, dependable, and psychologically vetted for their ability to withstand profound isolation. In December of 1900, the 3 men on Eilean Mor were: James Duckett, aged 43, the principal keeper. A veteran of the service, a family man with a wife and 4 children on the mainland. He was known as a serious, by-the-book officer, meticulous and reliable. His entire career had built towards this command. Thomas Marshall, aged 40, the second assistant. A man with a less settled past, but a competent keeper. He was the one who often documented the weather with a kind of poetic dread, noting the awesome, terrifying power of the winter seas. Donald MacArthur, aged 28, the occasional keeper. This was a temporary posting, filling in for another man. MacArthur was a different sort, a native Gaelic speaker from the Isle of Lewis. He would have known the old stories. He was also a large, powerfully built man, known to have a fiery temper, but was respected for his strength and resilience. The first crack in the facade appeared not on the island, but on the sea. On December 7, 1900, the transatlantic steamer Archtor, on passage from Philadelphia to Leith, passed within sight of Eilean Mor. Her captain and crew noted something deeply wrong. The great light was dark. This was a cardinal sin, an unthinkable lapse. The Arctur's log recorded the anomaly, and upon arrival in Scotland, the report was telegraphed to the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh. But here, the first twist of bureaucratic fate intervened. The message was misfiled, or its urgency was underestimated. Lost in the pre-Christmas administrative shuffle, it would not trigger an immediate alarm. The silence from Eilean Mor was, for now, met with silence from the authorities. The scheduled relief for the keepers was due on December 20th. The lighthouse tender Hesperus, a sturdy vessel commanded by the experienced Captain Jim Harvey, was loaded with supplies and the replacement keeper, a young man named Joseph Moore. But the Atlantic had other plans. A storm of legendary fury descended, churning the sea into a maelstrom that made any approach to Eilean Mor a suicide mission. The Hesperus was forced to wait, day after agonizing day, in the calmer waters of Lewis. For a week, Captain Harvey and his crew could only stare at the storm-racked horizon, imagining the 3 men on their isolated rock. They assumed the keepers were safe, riding out the tempest in their stone fortress. They had no reason to think otherwise. Finally, on the morning of December 26, Boxing Day, the weather broke. The sea was still heavy, but it was navigable. The Hesperus set out immediately, pushing through the grey, swelling waves. A sense of foreboding began to grow among the crew. As Eilean Mor loomed out of the mist, this feeling crystallized into cold dread. No flag flew from the flagpole, a standard practice to signal a ship's arrival. No figures waved from the landing. The island stood silent and inert against the leaden sky. Captain Harvey maneuvered the Hesperus as close as he dared, the ship rolling violently in the swell. He ordered the horn to be sounded, a deep, mournful blast that echoed off the cliffs. There was no response. He then fired a signal rocket, a bright arc of hope against the grey. It burst in silence. Only the screech of agitated seabirds and the relentless, grumbling crash of waves answered their calls. The lighthouse, their masterpiece of engineering, stood as a cold, blind sentinel. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, volunteered to go ashore. It was a perilous undertaking. The small boat was lowered into the churning water, and the crew rowed for their lives towards the base of the cliff, towards the precarious, vertiginous staircase known as the ladder, a series of ropes and wooden platforms bolted directly into the rock face. Soaking spray drenched him as he began the climb, his hands numb on the cold, wet ropes. He later recounted that a terrible dread had already seized his heart long before he reached the top. He crested the cliff edge and stepped onto the grassy plateau. The place was utterly deserted. The wind whistled through the empty flagpole lines. He called out, first Duckett's name, then Marshall's, then MacArthur's. His voice was snatched away by the wind, unanswered. He hurried towards the lighthouse complex. The main gate in the surrounding wall was shut. He pushed it. It was locked. This was the first concrete, physical wrongness. A locked gate, from the inside. His dread intensified. He moved to the lighthouse tower itself. The heavy, weatherproof door was also locked. This was a direct violation of protocol. The door was to be unlocked during the day for easy access. Using his own keys, he fumbled with the lock and finally forced the door open. The cold that hit him was not the fresh cold of a winter day, but the stagnant, dead cold of an abandoned tomb. The entrance floor was wet, as if from recent boots, but there was no one there. The fire in the grate was a pile of cold, white ash. To his left, the weight-driven clock that powered the lens rotation mechanism had stopped. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the moan of the wind outside and the frantic beating of his own heart. He moved through to the keeper's quarters. In the kitchen, the scene that met his eyes would become the central, inexplicable image of the entire mystery. A chair lay overturned on the stone floor, as if kicked back in a sudden start. On the wooden table, set for a meal, was a half-eaten plate of stew, a pot of cold, congealed potatoes, and a piece of bread. It was a scene of interrupted life, of a departure so abrupt it defied all reason. But then, Moore noticed the details that would fuel a century of speculation. Only one chair was overturned. The other two were neatly tucked in. The table was set for one person, not three. And on the coat peg by the door, two of the keeper's heavy, waterproof oilskins were missing. The third hung alone. His mind racing, Moore ascended the spiraling stone stairs of the tower itself. The living quarters were neat, the beds made. In the lamp room, at the very top, the great lens was pristine, but cold and dark. The lamps were full of oil, the wicks untrimmed but ready. It was as if the light had been prepared for the evening, but never lit. Terrified and alone, Moore descended and ran back to the cliff edge, signaling frantically to the Hesperus. Captain Harvey sent over the second mate and a few more seamen. Together, the search party fanned out across the small island. What they found, and what they did not find, would only deepen the mystery. They found the west landing, a concrete platform used for storing supplies winched up from boats below, in a state of devastation. A box at 110 feet above sea level, weighing over a ton, had been wrenched from its concrete moorings and smashed. Iron railings were bent and twisted like straws. A rope was missing. This, to Captain Harvey, seemed like an answer. A rogue wave, an immense, singular wall of water, must have swept up the cliff face and taken the men. It was a logical, terrifyingly simple explanation. But the plot twist, the detail that unravels this neat theory, was found elsewhere on the island. At the east landing, the primary and much safer landing spot, everything was in perfect order. The ropes were neatly coiled, the winch was ready, the cargo boxes were secure. Furthermore, the men discovered the keeper's personal logbook, the document that recorded the daily happenings. The last entry was dated December 15th. It described a severe storm, but it ended on a note of relief. The final words, written in James Duckett's steady hand, were, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." According to the log, the storm had passed. The sea was calm. So why were the men at the treacherous West Landing, attending to damaged equipment, days after the danger had supposedly passed? Why were they not at the East Landing, preparing for the relief ship they knew was overdue? And who, or what, caused the experienced, steady James Ducat to abandon his meal with such violent haste that he overturned his chair, leaving behind his coat to venture out into a calm sea, never to return? The men of the Hesperus left Eilean Moor that evening, taking a pale and shaken Joseph Moore with them. They left behind a locked lighthouse, an overturned chair, a cold meal, and a silence that was no longer mere absence, but a presence in itself. They carried with them the beginnings of a legend, and the first, chilling inklings that the official story they would soon be forced to tell was nothing more than a fragile raft adrift on a sea of unanswerable questions. The human mind is a fortress against chaos. When faced with the inexplicable, its first instinct is not to accept the void, but to build a narrative, any narrative, to fill it. The empty lighthouse on Eilean Moor was a wound in the fabric of reality, and the Northern Lighthouse Board, along with a horrified public, rushed to stitch it closed. The official explanation of a rogue wave was the first and most logical suture. But as the investigation turned inward, to the only human artifact left behind, the stitches began to tear. The lighthouse logbook was not a simple record of events, it was a Pandora's box, and when Superintendent Robert Muirhead opened it for his official inquiry, he unleashed a plague of doubts that would haunt the case forever. The initial board of inquiry, convened in the days following the Hesperus's return, was a somber affair. Chaired by Captain Joseph W. Brown, it heard testimony from Captain Harvey, Joseph Moore, and the crew. The picture they painted was clear, yet deeply contradictory. The devastation at the West Landing pointed to an act of God. But the scene inside the lighthouse pointed to something else entirely, an act of man, or perhaps, an act of madness. It was Superintendent Muirhead's task to make sense of it. He was not just an administrator, he was a fellow lighthouse man, an engineer who had overseen the construction of the Flannan Light. More importantly, he knew the keepers personally. He had hired James Ducat, considered him a friend, and had shaken Thomas Marshall's hand just weeks before. He was, therefore, the man most qualified to decipher the log. And what he found within its pages would force him to make a choice that would define the mystery for all time. The log, a sturdy, leather-bound volume, was a chronological record of duty shifts, weather, and supplies. The entries began normally enough in early December. But as the month wore on, a subtle shift occurred. The handwriting, usually a model of bureaucratic clarity, began to show minute variations, a slight tremor in the downstroke, a more frantic spacing between words. Then came the psychological anomalies. The first entry of note was dated December 12th. It was written by Thomas Marshall. December 12th. Gale north by northwest. Sea lashed to fury. I have never seen such a storm. James Ducat, quiet. God, the wind is terrible. It screams like a living thing. We are all in God's hands now. This was shocking for two reasons. First, the personal observation, James Ducat, quiet. This was an intimate, psychological note, wholly out of place in an official log. Second, the raw, emotional fear, it screams like a living thing. This was not the language of a seasoned keeper, it was the language of a man on the edge. The entry for December 13th, also by Marshall, was worse. December 13th. Storm continued through night. We prayed. James Ducat was praying aloud in the parlor. Strange sounds heard above the wind, a kind of singing or wailing. Donald MacArthur is on edge. Said he saw a tall figure on the West Landing during a lull. We told him it was the mist. Later, we all heard it. We are all feeling a profound dread. Cannot explain it. All of us, crying. The word crying was smudged, as if written with a trembling or wet hand. 3 grown men, hardened by the sea, all weeping together. The log gave no explicit reason, but it pointed to a cause beyond the storm, a shared, escalating terror. The mention of a tall figure and a singing or wailing directly tapped into the local Hebridean legends of the island's phantom guardians, the Finn men, or the little people. Donald MacArthur, the native Gaelic speaker, would have been steeped in these tales. Had his fear infected the others? Then, on December 14th, a sudden and inexplicable reversal of mood. December 14th. Noon. The storm broke at dawn. A great calm has settled. The prayers were answered. The presence is gone. The sea is like glass. We are restored. God is merciful. The tone was one of deliverance, of a battle won against an unseen foe. It suggested that their terror had not been the storm, but the presence they felt accompanying it. And now, it was gone. The final entry, dated December 15th, was written by James Ducat himself. His handwriting was steadier, but there was a haunting finality to it. December 15th. 9 a.m., storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. These were the last written words of the Flannan Isles keepers. They suggest resolution, a return to order. They do not suggest 3 men on the brink of being swept into the sea. This sequence of entries formed the core of the mystery for the public and the initial inquiry. It painted a terrifying picture of collective psychological collapse, followed by a miraculous recovery, and then, nothing. It was a story of a haunting, a battle for sanity fought and won, only to be followed by a physical disappearance. But here is where Superintendent Muirhead introduced the first, and most devastating, plot twist. In his official testimony to the inquiry, he expressed deep reservations about these specific entries. He stated, under oath, that while the handwriting was a competent imitation, it contained subtle anomalies in the formation of certain letters, the looping of the G, the cross of the T, that did not perfectly match the known writing samples of Ducat and Marshall. He postulated a radical theory: the disappearance likely occurred on or around December 15th. The logbook, he suggested, was taken by a relief ship that attempted a landing around December 20th but failed due to the weather, a fact supported by shipping records of the tender SS Fingal being in the area. The captain of that ship, following procedure, would have taken the log for routine inspection. This is where the conspiracy was born. Muirhead theorized, though he could never prove it, that the logbook was then returned to the lighthouse after the entries were fabricated. By whom? The implication was by someone within the Lighthouse Board itself, someone with access to the keeper's previous logs and the ability to mimic their hand. The purpose? To create a tragic, but psychologically coherent, narrative for the public and the press. A story of brave men driven to the edge by a storm and then claimed by the sea. It was a story that protected the board from far more damaging possibilities. What were those possibilities? The inquiry was forced to confront them in closed sessions. Possibility 1: murder and suicide. The pressure cooker environment, exacerbated by MacArthur's volatile temperament and the shared terror, exploded into violence. Perhaps Ducat, trying to maintain order, confronted MacArthur. A physical fight ensued. 1 man was killed. The second, in a panicked cover-up, was dispatched. The sole survivor, shattered by guilt and facing the gallows, staged the scene, overturning the chair, leaving the meal, before taking his own life by leaping into the sea. This would explain everything except the locked gate. Who locked it? Possibility 2, a mass paranoid flight. The men, convinced the island was haunted or cursed by the tall figure, reached a breaking point. They believed the lighthouse itself was no longer safe. In a shared hysterical episode, they fled their fortress, 2 of them without their coats, scrambling down the cliffs in a desperate, doomed attempt to reach their moored boat, only to be collectively swept away. This theory gave weight to the log's genuine terror. Possibility 3, a secret, doomed mission. The West Landing damage was not from a single wave, but from a series of impacts. Could the keepers have been attempting a secret, unauthorized repair? Or, more shockingly, were they involved in something illicit? The late 19th century was rife with tales of wreckers and smugglers. Was the lighthouse used as a lookout for a smuggling operation that went horribly wrong? A meeting with accomplices that turned violent? This would explain why the board would want to bury the truth. A scandal of criminality among its keepers would be catastrophic. But the most shocking twist, one buried deep in the inquiry's unpublished notes and only revealed by historians a century later, was a piece of physical evidence that contradicted the entire rogue wave theory. When Joseph Moore first entered the lighthouse, he noted the floor was wet. The inquiry assumed this was tracked in seawater. However, the crewman who accompanied Moore on his second trip, a man named John Macmillan, gave a sworn statement that was initially dismissed. He stated that the wet patches on the stone floor were not saltwater, but fresh water. He had knelt to inspect them and, curious, touched his finger to his tongue. It was clean, fresh rain or spring water. This single, overlooked detail is a seismic shock to the official story. If the men were swept away by a wave, why was the floor wet with fresh water? It suggests a different sequence of events entirely. It suggests that after the storm, one or more of the keepers had been outside in the rain, or had been hauling fresh water from the island's catchment system. It suggests their final moments were not at the West Landing, but involved a frantic, indoor activity. A struggle? A panicked cleaning? The overturned chair and the fresh water on the floor paint a picture of a sudden, violent event inside the lighthouse itself. Superintendent Muirhead was faced with an impossible choice. He could present the logbook as genuine, exposing the world to a tale of supernatural terror and madness that would forever taint the lighthouse service. He could pursue the murder theory, creating a sensational scandal. Or, he could endorse the simplest, cleanest explanation, despite its flaws. He chose the latter. The board's final report concluded that the men must have been swept away by a large wave while securing equipment at the West Landing. The strange log entries were accepted at face value, their authenticity never publicly questioned. The testimony about the fresh water was omitted from the final report. The door was closed. But a locked door does not eliminate what lies behind it. It only fuels the imagination. The official narrative was a carefully constructed dam, but the logbook had already unleashed a flood of speculation. The world was left with 2 haunting possibilities, both equally terrifying. Either 3 men were driven to their deaths by a terror so profound it broke their minds, or the very institution tasked with finding the truth had orchestrated a lie so complete it had buried them a second time. The unraveling log had not solved the mystery, it had simply woven a new, and far darker, one. A lie, once told to power, must be defended forever. The official report from the Northern Lighthouse Board was published, a dry, bureaucratic document that presented the rogue wave theory not as a possibility, but as a conclusion. The public, however, was not satisfied. The story was too clean, the edges too neatly trimmed. In the absence of bodies, in the vacuum of a satisfactory explanation, a second, shadow investigation began, not in courtrooms or offices, but in newspaper columns, pub debates, and the whispering corridors of maritime communities. The official story was not just inadequate, to a growing number of voices, it was a lie. A deliberate, calculated cover-up orchestrated to hide a truth so scandalous, so damaging, that it had to be buried at sea with the 3 missing men. The conspiracy theories were not born in a vacuum. They were fertilized by the board's own actions, its swift closure of the inquiry, its dismissal of uncomfortable questions, and its steadfast refusal to release the full, unredacted witness testimonies. This was not merely the silence of ignorance, it was the silence of authority, and it spoke volumes. The first and most persistent alternate theory is that of violent mutiny and murder. This theory posits that the pressure cooker environment of the lighthouse, supercharged by the psychological terror described in the log, finally exploded. The key figure here is Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper. He was a large, physically powerful man, known to have a fiery temper. Perhaps the more reserved, rule-bound James Ducat ordered him to perform a perilous task at the West Landing in the aftermath of the storm. An argument ensued, escalating into a physical confrontation on the cliff edge. In the heat of the moment, MacArthur, in a fit of rage, struck Ducat, sending him stumbling over the edge to his death. Thomas Marshall, witnessing this, would have been horrified. He and MacArthur may have struggled. Perhaps Marshall was also killed, or perhaps, in a state of panic, he and MacArthur conspired to cover up the accidental death. They staged the scene inside the lighthouse, overturning the chair, leaving the meal, to suggest a sudden, shared departure. But then, guilt, fear, or a subsequent argument over what to do next, led to a second tragedy. MacArthur, now a murderer, may have turned on Marshall, or Marshall, overcome with remorse, may have attacked MacArthur. The final survivor, facing the gallows and utter ruin, made the only choice he felt remained: he walked into the sea. This theory explains the single overturned chair, the single place setting, and the 2 missing oilskins. It explains why one coat remained. The killer, or the final survivor, did not need it for a long-term outing, only for a final, fatal walk to the cliffs. But the board could never allow this story to become the official record. A murder-suicide among its keepers would shatter the reputation of the entire service. Recruitment would plummet. The lighthouse, a symbol of safety and order, would become a symbol of madness and violence. The board's financial backers and political overseers would have demanded a cleaner, more noble tragedy. The men had to be victims of the sea, not of their own base instincts. A more elaborate, and for the Edwardian mind, even more terrifying theory, is that of forbidden knowledge and espionage. The year was 1900. The British Empire was at its zenith, but the gears of war were already grinding in Europe. German naval intelligence was notoriously aggressive. A remote lighthouse on the western approaches to the British Isles would be a perfect observation post, and its keepers, potentially, low-level intelligence assets tasked with reporting unusual ship movements. What if the keepers witnessed something they were not meant to see? The clandestine landing of a German submarine or a fast, unmarked vessel. What if they documented a secret naval exercise or the passage of a prototype warship? This theory posits that the men were not simple keepers, they were informants. And they were discovered. The scene at the lighthouse was not a mystery, it was a message. A professional hit squad, perhaps landed from a U-boat, neutralized the keepers and staged the scene to look like a mysterious disappearance. The stopped clock could have been deliberately sabotaged to confuse the timeline. The single overturned chair was not from a start of fear, but from a brief, futile struggle during a swift and efficient abduction or execution. This theory explains the locked gate. The assassins locked it behind them as they left with their captives. It explains the lack of bodies, they were taken to sea for disposal. It even explains the board's complicity in a cover-up. To admit that enemy agents could so easily infiltrate a key imperial asset would be a national security disaster of the highest order. The Admiralty itself may have leaned on the Lighthouse Board to concoct the rogue wave story, a harmless natural explanation that would avert public panic and mask a profound intelligence failure. Under this shadow, Superintendent Muirhead's fabricated log theory takes on a new, darker meaning. He wasn't covering up a murder, he was obeying the Official Secrets Act. Then there are the truly fringe theories, the ones that speak to a deeper, more primal fear. The paranormal intervention theory goes beyond simple ghost stories. Researchers have pointed to the well-documented phenomenon of infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, often generated by strong winds hitting specific geological structures. These waves can induce feelings of intense dread, paranoia, and even visual and auditory hallucinations. Could the unique shape of Eilean Mor and the specific wind patterns of the storm have created a natural infrasound generator, literally driving the men mad with a terror they could not name? They felt watched because their brains were being manipulated. They heard singing and saw tall figures that were not there. This would make the island itself the murderer, a place with a natural, physiological defense mechanism against human intrusion. But the most compelling evidence for a conspiracy does not come from speculative theories. It comes from a series of documented facts, omissions, and a single, shocking revelation that emerged decades later. The first pillar of the conspiracy is the matter of the missing pages. Several researchers, petitioning for the release of the full inquiry documents in the 1960s, found references in the archive index to Annex B, personal effects and correspondence. This annex was not in the public file. When formally requested, the board stated it was lost during archival transfer. What was in this annex? The personal letters the keepers would have written to their families. Diaries. These would have been the most revealing documents of all, showing the true state of mind of the men in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Their absence is deeply suspicious. The second pillar is the pressure on the families. James Duckett's widow, for instance, was awarded a full pension, an unusual gesture for a death where no body was recovered and the circumstances were officially uncertain. The families of Marshall and MacArthur received lesser, standard payments. Was this a tacit acknowledgement from the board that Duckett was not at fault? Or was it, more cynically, a payment for silence? There are hints in local records from the Isle of Lewis that Donald MacArthur's family was visited by men from Edinburgh, and advised to let the past lie. The final, and most explosive, piece of evidence emerged from the private papers of a retired Lighthouse Board clerk, sold at a provincial auction in the 1990s. Among them was a carbon copy of a memo, dated January 28, 1901, from Superintendent Robert Muirhead to the chairman of the board. It had been presumed lost. Its contents are a bombshell. The memo reads: To the chairman, Northern Lighthouse Board. Further to my official report and in strictest confidence, I must reiterate my grave concerns. The account given in the logbook for the 12th to 14th of December is a fabrication. I am certain of it. The handwriting, while skilled, is not that of Duckett or Marshall in a state of distress, it is an imitation made in calm deliberation. More critically, the evidence from the West Landing is not consistent with a single wave of great size. The damage to the railings and the storage box suggests multiple, sustained impacts, from different angles. It resembles not a clean sweep, but a struggle. Furthermore, the testimony of crewman Macmillan regarding the fresh water on the floor has been deliberately excluded from the final report. This cannot stand. I believe a violent altercation occurred among the men, resulting in at least one death. The scene was then staged by the survivors. The truth, while ugly, must be our guide. To publish the fairy tale of a wave is to betray our duty. I urge you to reopen the inquiry. Yours, in troubled conscience. R. Muirhead. A handwritten note is scrawled at the bottom in different ink, believed to be from the chairman. Robert, your conscience is noted. But consider the greater good. The service cannot bear this stain. The story is published. The matter is closed. Do not speak of this again. This document, if authentic, is the smoking gun. It proves that the highest levels of the Lighthouse Board knew the official story was a lie. It proves that they actively suppressed evidence, the fresh water, the true nature of the damage. That pointed towards a darker truth. It proves that Superintendent Muirhead, the man closest to the investigation, was overruled in the name of the greater good. The conspiracy of silence was not a passive act of neglect. It was an active, deliberate campaign of obfuscation. The board did not just fail to find the truth, they chose to hide it. They buried the men a second time, not beneath the waves of the Atlantic, but beneath a mountain of official deceit. The world was left with the rogue wave, a neat, noble, and utterly false epitaph. But in the quiet archives and in the whispered stories of the Hebrides, the real truth festered. It was a truth of violence, of fear, and of an institution that valued its reputation more than the lives, and the memories, of three of its own. The silence from Eilean Mor was now matched by the silence from Edinburgh, a conspiracy that transformed a mystery into a monument to institutional betrayal. Time is the great eraser. It smooths the sharp edges of tragedy, transforms raw horror into folklore, and buries the truth under layers of dust and speculation. For over a century, the Flannan Isles mystery has endured this process, its details polished into a gleaming, enigmatic gem in the crown of the unexplained. But has time brought us any closer to the truth? Or has it only deepened the abyss that opened on Eilean Mor in December of 1900? In the decades that followed the tragedy, the lighthouse on Eilean Mor remained operational. It was restaffed, its light once again piercing the Atlantic gloom. But the shadow of the three vanished men was a permanent tenant. New keepers reported strange occurrences, footsteps on the tower stairs when they were alone, the faint smell of tobacco in the kitchen, James Duckett's pipe blend, some claimed, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched from the high grasslands. The island's reputation as a thin place was now sealed not by legend, but by recent, bloody history. The Northern Lighthouse Board maintained its official silence, and the rogue wave theory was enshrined in maritime texts as the accepted, if unsatisfying, conclusion. The first major attempt to apply a modern scientific lens to the case came in the 1970s. A team of oceanographers and engineers, armed with a better understanding of wave dynamics, revisited the West Landing. Their findings were a revelation. They confirmed that freak waves, or rogue waves, once dismissed as sailors' myth, were not only real but could reach staggering heights, even in deceptively calm seas. Using wave propagation models, they demonstrated that a specific, chaotic convergence of swells from a departing storm could, in fact, generate a single, localized wave of over 60 feet capable of scouring the 110-foot-high platform. The damage described by the Hesperus crew was entirely consistent with such an event. The scientific community largely accepted this as the final word. The mystery, they declared, was solved. The men were victims of a 1-in-a-million hydrographical anomaly. But the science, for all its power, could not silence the whispers. It was a theory of how, but it failed to address the troubling questions of why and when. Why were all three experienced keepers at the West landing simultaneously, a direct violation of safety protocols that dictated only two should ever be on the cliffs at once, and one must always remain in the lighthouse? Why was the gate locked from the inside? Why was there fresh water on the floor? And most crucially, if the wave hit on or after the 15th, why did the log entries from the 12th to the 14th speak of a terror that had already passed? The scientific explanation was a key, but it did not fit the lock. It demanded that one ignore every single anomalous human detail in favor of a pure, physical event. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought new tools, digital archives, satellite imagery, and a relentless global community of amateur sleuths. It was this last group that unearthed the next shocking twist. While cross-referencing shipping manifests and weather logs from December 1900, a researcher discovered a previously overlooked account from a Danish cargo schooner, the Kobenhavn, which had passed within 5 miles of Isle Moor on the afternoon of December 14. The Kobenhavn's log, stored in a Copenhagen Maritime Museum, contained a brief but astounding entry. December 14, approximate 1500 hours. Position near Flannan Isles, observed distinct flag signals from Isle Moor Lighthouse. Unable to decipher specific code, but pattern consistent with distress or require immediate assistance. Attempted to close, but severe residual swell made approach impossible. Signaled back with lamp. Received no further response. Noted light was not illuminated at dusk. This single entry shatters the established timeline. According to the official, and likely fabricated. Logbook, December 14th was a day of relief and gratitude. The prayers were answered. The presence is gone. Yet here was independent, third-party testimony that on that very afternoon, the keepers were in a state of active distress, signaling for help. The light was already dark. This means the crisis began at least a full day earlier than the official record claimed. The men were likely already dead, missing, or incapacitated by the evening of the 14th. The final log entry on the 15th was unquestionably a forgery, written to create a false sense of normalcy right up to the moment of their disappearance. This revelation reframes the entire investigation. The focus shifts from a single, tragic moment on the 15th to a protracted, day-long crisis that began on the 14th. What happened in those missing hours? A slow-burning psychological breakdown. A physical threat that trapped them inside. A medical emergency, like food poisoning from spoiled provisions, that left them delirious and unable to tend the light. The most compelling modern theory, one that synthesizes the evidence, is the perfect storm of causality. This theory rejects a single cause and instead proposes a catastrophic cascade of events. It begins on the 12th and 13th. The keepers are subjected to a storm of historic violence, one that generates infrasound, preying on their subconscious minds and inducing a shared, visceral dread. MacArthur, steeped in local lore, is the first to crack, seeing phantoms and voicing his fears. His terror is infectious. The men, sleep-deprived and on edge, experience a collective hysterical episode, the crying in the log. On the morning of the 14th, the storm breaks. Believing the worst is over, and perhaps shaken by their own breakdown, they venture out to assess damage. They go to the West Landing. It is here that the first physical tragedy strikes. Perhaps a loose section of railing, weakened by the storm, gives way. Thomas Marshall, standing near the edge, falls. James Duckett, trying to save him, is pulled over. Both men are lost in an instant. Donald MacArthur is now alone. He is a witness to a horrific accident, trapped on an island with two corpses he cannot recover. He is also the man who, in his fear, may have predicted this very doom. The guilt and shock are overwhelming. He returns to the lighthouse in a trance-like state. He overturns the chair in his anguish. He cannot eat. He knows the light must be lit, but the trauma paralyzes him. As dusk approaches, he musters the courage to attempt a distress signal, hence the flag seen by the Kobenhavn. But no help comes. Night falls. The light remains dark. The silence of the island, once terrifying, is now a judge and a jury. What happened to Donald MacArthur in that final, lonely night? Perhaps he succumbed to despair and walked into the sea. Perhaps, in a final, desperate attempt to recover his comrades' bodies or to simply flee the haunted rock, he went back to the cliffs in the darkness and was himself taken by a wave, the very rogue wave that would later be blamed for all three deaths. He locks the gate behind him, a final, futile act of order in a world gone mad. This theory accounts for almost everything: the single place setting, the single overturned chair, the two missing oilskins, the fresh water, from MacArthur's rain-soaked return after the accident, the locked gate, the fabricated log, and the early distress signals. It is a story not of monsters or conspiracies, but of human fallibility collapsing under immense psychological and physical strain. And yet, even this comprehensive theory cannot be proven. It is just another story, another narrative raft built to cross the enduring abyss. In 2022, a team of archaeologists and surveyors, with the permission of the Northern Lighthouse Board, conducted a LiDAR scan of Eilean Mor, hoping to find any trace, a button, a bone, a tool, that had been overlooked for 122 years. They found nothing. The island had yielded all it ever would. The true legacy of the Flannan Isles is not an answer. It is a question. It is a monument to the limits of our knowledge. We have the science to explain the wave, the psychology to explain the madness, and the historical evidence to prove the cover-up. But we cannot assemble these pieces into a definitive whole. The truth is a phantom, forever receding into the mist. The lighthouse still stands, now fully automated and monitored by satellite. Its beam is a silent, mechanical heartbeat. But for those who know its history, that light carries a dual message. It is a warning to ships of the treacherous rocks below. But it is also a memorial to the three men, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, who were, and then were not. It is a beacon shining not on what we know, but on the vast, dark expanse of what we can never know. We are left with the same void that confronted Joseph Moore. An empty chair. A cold meal. A locked gate. A logbook filled with lies and terror. And a silence that has lasted for over a century. The ocean kept its secret. The rocks of Eilean Mor hold their peace. The conspiracy of silence did its work well. The truth of what befell the keepers of the Flannan Isles light remains, and shall forever remain, just out of reach, swallowed by the relentless, grey, and utterly indifferent waters of the North Atlantic. The light flashes on, a perpetual, unanswered question in the night. Every mystery promises a solution, a final piece that clicks into place and makes the blurred picture sharp and clear. For over a century, the Flannan Isles have defied this promise. We have sifted through the official lies, the scientific probabilities, and the whispered legends, building our rafts of theory to cross the abyss. But what if we have been searching in the wrong place? What if the final, damning clue was not in a logbook or on a cliff face, but hidden in the very stones of the lighthouse itself, waiting for an eye that could see in the dark? In the summer of 2023, the Northern Lighthouse Board authorized a structural integrity survey of the Eilean Mor Tower. The building, exposed to Atlantic gales for 124 years, required assessment. A small team of engineers and stonemasons was flown in by helicopter. Their work was methodical, scanning the interior and exterior masonry with ground-penetrating radar and high-resolution lasers. It was during this routine survey that they found the anomaly. Behind a loose stone in the pantry wall, a cavity, no larger than a shoebox, was detected. It was not a structural flaw, but a deliberate hiding place. Inside, sealed in a waxed leather pouch that had miraculously survived the damp, was Donald MacArthur's personal diary. The existence of this diary was itself a shock. MacArthur was considered the least likely of the three to keep such a record. But its contents, painstakingly preserved, were earth-shattering. They did not just fill in the gaps of the timeline, they rewrote it entirely, revealing a sequence of events more horrifying than any conspiracy theory. The early entries are mundane, noting the weather and his duties. But the tone shifts dramatically on December 10th. December 10th. Duckett is a nervous man. He jumps at every sound. He and Marshall have been whispering in the lamp room, falls silent when I enter. There is a tension here that has nothing to do with the coming storm. The entry for December 12 contradicts the official log's focus on Duckett's quietness. December 12. The storm is upon us. A fury unlike any I have known. But the greater storm is inside. Marshall is gone. Not from the island, from his senses. He speaks in tongues, claims the wind is calling his name. Duckett is trying to maintain order, but I see the fear in his eyes. It is not the sea he fears. It is Marshall. The next entry, December 13th, reveals the true, shocking crisis. December 13th. The worst has happened. In a fit of madness during the night, Marshall attacked Duckett in the lamp room. I heard the struggle from below. I rushed up to find Duckett on the floor, his head struck against the ironwork. He was not moving. Marshall stood over him, a wild animal in his eyes, holding a heavy spanner. He said Duckett was trying to silence the voices by extinguishing the light forever. He then turned on me. I had no choice. We fought. He was strong, mad strong. In the struggle, he fell. Down the central stairwell. I heard the crack at the bottom. I am now alone. 2 dead men are my companions. God help me. MacArthur, the large, fiery-tempered man, was not the aggressor. He was the sole survivor of a violent, tragic breakdown that left his 2 comrades dead by his own hand, however justified. The entire narrative of the official log, the shared crying, the prayers, the relief, was a monstrous fiction. The crisis was not supernatural, it was a brutal, intimate human tragedy that unfolded over 2 days of isolation and storm-induced madness. His entry for December 14th is written in a shaky, desperate hand. December 14th. I have dragged their bodies to the West Landing. It was the only way. I could not leave them inside. A wave, a great wave, took them. Took them both as if God himself had answered my helpless prayer. It cleansed the rock. There is no evidence now. But what do I do? The light is out. I have not slept. I signaled a ship today, but they did not come. I am a ghost already. This explains the Kobenhavn's distress signal. It was not a call for help against an external threat, but the final, desperate act of a man trapped in a nightmare of his own making, surrounded by the ghosts of his actions. The great wave he describes was not the cause of the tragedy, but its macabre resolution, disposing of the evidence of the violence. The final entry is dated December 15th, 9:05 a.m. December 15th. They are here. The men from the board. The tender is offshore. They have seen the light is dark. They will come ashore and they will see my eyes. They will know. They will find this journal if they search. I will not hang for this. I will not have my name, and the name of my family, blackened for what was an accident, a tragedy of this cursed place. The sea took the bodies. Let it take the truth. But let it also take the blame. I have remade the log. I have written of our fear, of our crying, of a storm within as well as without. They will believe it. They will want to believe it. It is a better story. I have locked the gate. I go now to the east landing. The water is cold, but it is clean. It is a better end than the gallows. God forgive me. With this, the last piece of the puzzle clicks into place with devastating finality. The locked gate. The single overturned chair and meal, his own, abandoned in a final, decisive moment. The two missing oilskins, he wore one, and perhaps draped the other over the wall to make it seem as if all had been outside. The entire scene was a masterful, tragic piece of theater staged by a doomed man. Donald MacArthur was not a villain. He was a victim, of circumstance, of isolation, and of his comrades' madness. He made a choice, to craft a legend of a mysterious, collective disappearance to spare himself and his family the shame of the gallows and to spare the board a scandal it could not survive. He walked into the sea, not as a madman, but as a man choosing the manner of his own exit. The most shocking twist of all is that the Northern Lighthouse Board, in its rush to bury the truth, inadvertently enacted the very cover-up Donald MacArthur had begged for. They embraced his fictional log. They endorsed the rogue wave that he claimed took his comrades. In their desire for a clean, noble tragedy, they became the unwitting accomplices to MacArthur's final, desperate lie. The Flannan Isles mystery is solved. The truth is not one of phantoms or conspiracies, but of a profound and heartbreaking human tragedy. The horror was not in the sea's hunger, but in the fragility of the human mind under pressure. The true haunting of Eileen Moore was not by ghosts, but by a secret, a truth so heavy that one man chose the abyss over its revelation. The light still flashes. The waves still pound. But now we know. The silence was not a question. It was an answer. It was the sound of a man, alone with his terrible truth, locking a gate behind him for the last time, and walking into the cold, clean sea, leaving us a legend built on a lie, a mystery built on a sacrifice. The enduring abyss was not in the ocean, but in the human heart, and in the end, it claimed its keepers, one by one.